It was a warm evening in a small southern town, the kind of evening that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. The streetlights flickered to life as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Families were wrapping up their day, and the faint hum of conversations and laughter floated out from the open windows of homes and restaurants. Among these places was a popular diner, known for its neon sign that buzzed faintly and the smell of sizzling burgers wafting through the air. For most people in town, it was a welcoming spot, a place where stories were shared over milkshakes and fries. But tonight, something different was about to unfold. James Carter, a black veteran who had recently returned to his hometown after years of service, stepped onto the diner's worn threshold. His uniform was crisp, his medals polished, and his heart carried the weight of battles fought far away. James had seen the worst of humanity on distant battlefields, but he had also witnessed bravery, camaraderie, and sacrifice that transcended skin color and backgrounds. He walked with quiet dignity, his shoulders broad and his stride confident. But there was a shadow of uncertainty in his eyes, a flicker of apprehension as he reached for the door. Inside, the diner was alive with chatter and the clatter of dishes. The owner, a burly man named Frank, stood behind the counter. Frank had run the place for years and was known for his sharp tongue and stricter-than-usual demeanor. He had a way of commanding attention, and most of the town respected him, or at least feared crossing him. Tonight, as James entered, Frank's gaze shifted from the customer he was serving to the man in uniform now standing in the doorway. His eyes narrowed, and the cheerful din of the diner seemed to falter for just a moment. James's presence drew more than a few looks. Some were curious, others wary. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering questions about the man in the uniform. An older gentleman at the corner table nodded respectfully, recognizing James from his younger days. But there were also murmurs, barely audible but sharp enough to cut. James noticed, but he'd grown accustomed to the weight of such moments. He approached the counter with quiet resolve, his voice steady as he greeted Frank. "Evening. I'd like a table, if there's one available." Frank didn't reply immediately. Instead, he leaned on the counter, his expression unreadable. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for his response. "We're full up tonight," Frank finally said, his voice flat. But James could see the empty booths near the windows and the two-seat table in the corner that had just been cleared. "I don't mind waiting," James offered, his tone polite but firm. He wasn't one to cause trouble, but he also wasn't about to be dismissed so easily. Frank's jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms. "I said we're full." His words hung heavy in the air, carrying an unspoken meaning that everyone in the room understood. A few patrons exchanged uneasy glances, while others avoided looking at James altogether. James stood there, his posture unwavering. The room felt smaller, the tension thicker. Memories of his service flashed through his mind. The camaraderie of his unit, the sacrifices they made for each other, regardless of race. He'd fought for freedoms that now seemed elusive in his own hometown. But James wasn't a stranger to moments like these. He knew the power of staying calm, of choosing his battles wisely. Yet, this wasn't just about him. It was about the principles he'd fought to uphold, the dignity he refused to surrender. "Is there a problem, Frank?" A voice broke through the silence. It was Mary, a waitress who had worked at the diner for years. She'd seen her share of disputes, but had always tried to smooth things over. Her question was direct, her tone steady, but there was an edge of defiance in her gaze as she looked at Frank. Frank's eyes flicked to Mary, and for a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then he straightened, his expression hardening further. "No problem," he said curtly, "just making it clear that we have rules here." Mary's lips tightened, and she looked at James. "Sir, why don't you have a seat? I'll bring you a menu." James hesitated, his eyes meeting Mary's. There was kindness there, a silent acknowledgement of the unfairness he was facing. He nodded slightly and moved toward an empty booth. But before he could sit down, Frank's voice rang out again. I said we're full. The room fell silent once more. All eyes were on James and Frank, the air thick with unspoken tension. James turned back slowly, his expression calm but resolute. This was a different kind of battlefield, one he'd faced before, but never quite got used to. And as he stood there, the question lingered. How far would Frank go, and how much was James willing to endure? The moment hung in the balance, a fragile pause that could shatter in any direction. Outside, the night deepened, the stars beginning to glimmer in the darkened sky. Inside, the diner felt like the center of the universe, a stage set for confrontation that was far from over. It was a warm evening in a small southern town, the kind of evening that made the world feel like it was holding its breath. The streetlights flickered to life as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Families were wrapping up their day, and the faint hum of conversations and laughter floated out from the open windows of homes and restaurants. Among these places was a popular diner, known for its neon sign that buzzed faintly and the smell of sizzling burgers wafting through the air. For most people in town, it was a welcoming spot, a place where stories were shared over milkshakes and fries. But tonight, something different was about to unfold. James Carter, a black veteran who had recently returned to his hometown after years of service, stepped onto the diner's worn threshold. His uniform was crisp, his medals polished, and his heart carried the weight of battles fought far away. James had seen the worst of humanity on distant battlefields, but he had also witnessed bravery, camaraderie, and sacrifice that transcended skin color and backgrounds. He walked with quiet dignity, his shoulders broad and his stride confident. But there was a shadow of uncertainty in his eyes, a flicker of apprehension as he reached for the door. Inside, the diner was alive with chatter and the clatter of dishes. The owner, a burly man named Frank, stood behind the counter. Frank had run the place for years and was known for his sharp tongue and stricter-than-usual demeanor. He had a way of commanding attention, and most of the town respected him, or at least feared crossing him. Tonight, as James entered, Frank's gaze shifted from the customer he was serving to the man in uniform now standing in the doorway. His eyes narrowed, and the cheerful din of the diner seemed to falter for just a moment. James's presence drew more than a few looks. Some were curious, others wary. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering questions about the man in the uniform. An older gentleman at the corner table nodded respectfully, recognizing James from his younger days. But there were also murmurs, barely audible but sharp enough to cut. James noticed, but he'd grown accustomed to the weight of such moments. He approached the counter with quiet resolve, his voice steady as he greeted Frank. "Evening. I'd like a table, if there's one available." Frank didn't reply immediately. Instead, he leaned on the counter, his expression unreadable. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for his response. "We're full up tonight," Frank finally said, his voice flat. But James could see the empty booths near the windows and the two-seat table in the corner that had just been cleared. "I don't mind waiting," James offered, his tone polite but firm. He wasn't one to cause trouble, but he also wasn't about to be dismissed so easily. Frank's jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms. "I said we're full." His words hung heavy in the air, carrying an unspoken meaning that everyone in the room understood. A few patrons exchanged uneasy glances, while others avoided looking at James altogether. James stood there, his posture unwavering. The room felt smaller, the tension thicker. Memories of his service flashed through his mind, the camaraderie of his unit, the sacrifices they made for each other, regardless of race. He'd fought for freedoms that now seemed elusive in his own hometown. But James wasn't a stranger to moments like these. He knew the power of staying calm, of choosing his battles wisely. Yet, this wasn't just about him. It was about the principles he'd fought to uphold, the dignity he refused to surrender. "Is there a problem, Frank?" A voice broke through the silence. It was Mary, a waitress who had worked at the diner for years. She'd seen her share of disputes, but had always tried to smooth things over. Her question was direct, her tone steady, but there was an edge of defiance in her gaze as she looked at Frank. Frank's eyes flicked to Mary, and for a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then he straightened, his expression hardening further. "No problem," he said curtly. "Just making it clear that we have rules here." Mary's lips tightened, and she looked at James. "Sir, why don't you have a seat? I'll bring you a menu." James hesitated, his eyes meeting Mary's. There was kindness there, a silent acknowledgement of the unfairness he was facing. He nodded slightly and moved toward an empty booth. But before he could sit down, Frank's voice rang out again. "I said we're full." The room fell silent once more. All eyes were on James and Frank, the air thick with unspoken tension. James turned back slowly, his expression calm but resolute. This was a different kind of battlefield, one he'd faced before but never quite got used to. And as he stood there, the question lingered. How far would Frank go, and how much was James willing to endure? The moment hung in the balance, a fragile pause that could shatter in any direction. Outside, the night deepened, the stars beginning to glimmer in the darkened sky. Inside, the diner felt like the center of the universe, a stage set for a confrontation that was far from over. Mary's voice broke the silence again, this time softer but resolute. "Frank, let the man sit. He's just here for a meal, same as everyone else." Her words carried weight, and a few of the patrons murmured in agreement, though most remained silent, their eyes darting between the two men. Frank's skull deepened, but he seemed to sense the shifting mood in the room. He grumbled something under his breath and turned away, wiping the counter with exaggerated force. Mary gave James a small nod and gestured toward the booth. James took the seat, his movements deliberate, as though claiming his space without apology. Mary brought over a menu, placing it gently in front of him. "Take your time," she said, her voice kind but tinged with an undercurrent of frustration. James thanked her quietly, opening the menu and scanning the options, though his focus was elsewhere. He could feel the weight of the room's gaze, the unspoken judgments and curiosities pressing in on him. As he sat there, James couldn't help but think back to his time in the service. He remembered the long nights in the barracks, the way his unit had bonded over shared hardships. They'd faced enemies together, celebrated victories, and mourned losses as a family. The men he'd served with had seen him as a soldier first, a brother in arms. Yet here, in the town he'd once called home, he was a stranger, an unwelcome presence in a place that should have been familiar. A soft cough interrupted his thoughts. It was the older gentleman from the corner table, who had walked over and now stood nearby. "Young man," he said, his voice low but firm, "I just wanted to say thank you for your service." James looked up, surprised by the man's sincerity. "Thank you, sir," he replied, his voice steady. The man nodded and returned to his seat, leaving behind a ripple of acknowledgement that seemed to shift the atmosphere just slightly. But not everyone was moved. A group of younger men sitting near the back exchanged glances, their laughter sharp and pointed. One of them leaned forward, his voice loud enough to carry. "Guess they'll let anyone wear a uniform these days." The words hit like a slap, but James didn't react immediately. He'd learned to pick his battles, to weigh the cost of every confrontation. He glanced at Mary, who shot the men a sharp look, but didn't say anything. Frank, meanwhile, pretended not to hear, his focus firmly on the grill. James closed the menu and placed it on the table. His appetite had waned, replaced by a simmering resolve. He wasn't here to fight, but he also wasn't going to let their words define him. He straightened in his seat, his gaze steady as he waited for Mary to return. Outside, the night stretched on, the hum of crickets filling the quiet spaces left by the tension inside the diner. And still the question lingered. How far would this go, and who would stand with him when it mattered most? The night hung heavy, as though the very air had become thicker, pressing down on every breath. The streets, usually bustling with life, seemed to have emptied, leaving behind only an eerie silence broken by the occasional distant echo of a footstep or a faint rustle in the shadows. Underneath the flickering streetlights, a sense of unease settled over the city, a sense that something was slipping through the cracks, something no one fully understood yet, but they all felt it. Amelia paused at the edge of the alley, her heart pounding with every step. She had heard the rumors, seen the strange figures that lurked just beyond the city's borders, but nothing had prepared her for the truth. The whispers spoke of a power greater than anything they had ever known, a force that would shift the balance and change everything. But no one knew exactly how or when it would happen. All they knew was that time was running out. Her fingers tightened around the crumpled letter in her pocket, the only lead she had, though she couldn't shake the feeling that it was a trap. The words had been vague, promises of answers, of revelations, but the deeper she dug, the more she realized she was stumbling into a web far more dangerous than she had imagined. The more she uncovered, the more the pieces fell into place, each one leading to another question, another dark corner where the truth had been buried for years. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan stood before a locked door, the rusted key in his hand feeling far too heavy. He had been tasked with protecting the artifact, the one piece that could either save or doom them all. But the longer he stood there, staring at the door, the more he felt like he was running out of time. The voices in his head, once whispers, had grown louder, urging him to unlock it, to confront whatever was hidden inside. But was he ready? Was anyone? He didn't know who to trust anymore. The lines between ally and enemy had blurred, and as much as he wanted to believe the stories of hope, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of betrayal that followed every step he took. Was he being led into a trap, or was this the moment they had all been waiting for? The pressure was mounting, and with every passing hour, the walls seemed to close in on him. Amelia's name echoed in his mind, though he hadn't seen her in days. He knew she was in the city, somewhere, still searching for answers, but he wasn't sure if they could trust each other anymore. Secrets had a way of unraveling, and the more they shared, the more dangerous the game became. As midnight drew near, the tension reached a boiling point. The city was on the edge of something unknown, the darkness creeping closer, pushing them toward an inevitable confrontation. Amelia and Ethan, each alone in their own struggle, were unknowingly moving closer to the same inevitable fate. They just didn't know it yet. But the clock was ticking, and no one was ready for what lay ahead. Secrets would be exposed, alliances would be tested, and nothing would ever be the same again. Amelia's feet barely touched the ground as she sprinted through the narrow, winding streets. The dim glow of streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to reach for her, pulling at her every step. She could hear her own breath, ragged and uneven, echoing in her ears. The letter she had found, the one that had started all of this, was now tucked deep inside her coat, its meaning clearer, yet more terrifying than ever. The mention of the artifact, the one Ethan was guarding, had been no coincidence. Everything pointed to the moment they were both unknowingly racing toward. But there was no time to waste. She had seen the figures again, those dark silhouettes that moved in ways no human should, and they were closer now. Their presence had been more than a shadow in the periphery. They were closing in. The uneasy feeling that had gnawed at her since the beginning now gripped her chest in a vice, tighter with each passing second. Every instinct told her to keep running, but the truth weighed heavily on her mind. Ethan didn't even know what he was guarding. If he did, maybe he would understand why he was being hunted. As she turned the corner, she came face to face with the impossible. Two of the figures standing in her way, cloaked in darkness, their faces hidden behind masks. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, eyes darting for an escape, but they were too close, too swift. The air felt thick with something she couldn't explain, as though the very fabric of reality had begun to warp. They hadn't said a word, but she could feel their presence in every inch of her skin. She knew this was the moment everything collided. Yet, there was no going back. Not now. Meanwhile, Ethan was standing at the threshold of the old, forgotten building. The door was still locked, but the key in his hand burned with an urgency that had taken root in him over the last few days. It felt like it had been calling to him, whispering through his thoughts. It had been a slow build, doubts, suspicions, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility. But now, in the silence of the night, it was as though the weight had become unbearable. Something was wrong. He had heard whispers through the corridors of the city, stories that didn't add up, people who had disappeared without a trace. He had been trying to protect the artifact, but what if protecting it was the wrong thing to do? What if, by holding it, he was sealing everyone's fate? The sound of footsteps behind him snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned quickly, hand instinctively reaching for his gun, but the figure that emerged from the shadows wasn't a threat. It was familiar. Too familiar. It was the last person he expected to see. Amelia, he breathed, his voice low but heavy with disbelief. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear, but there was a strange resolve in them. She moved toward him, glancing over her shoulder as if something were following her, and in that moment, Ethan felt the air grow colder. She was shaken, but he knew her well enough to see that something deeper was at play. "They're coming," she whispered urgently, her voice tight. "They found us. The artifact. It's not just a weapon. It's something worse." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew what she was saying, but he wasn't ready to believe it. How could it be worse than what they had already uncovered? But before he could ask, the world around them seemed to shift. The ground trembled, a low hum vibrating beneath their feet. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch toward them like dark fingers. Amelia's grip tightened on his arm, pulling him closer. "They know we're here," she said, barely above a whisper. And then, as if on cue, the sound of voices reached them, a low murmur that quickly turned into a chant. The figures they had both feared were now closing in, surrounding them from every angle. The city itself seemed to bend around them, as if it were complicit in what was coming. Ethan's eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The tension was unbearable, the silence before the storm deafening. Every instinct told him to run, to fight, but something in the air told him this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was bigger. This was the moment that would change everything. They were running out of time. The artifact, the prophecy, the figures that moved like shadows, they were all part of something he hadn't even begun to understand. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet cracked open, and a blinding light poured through, illuminating the darkened streets in a flash. It felt as though the city itself was awakening. The figures stepped forward, their eyes glinting with a purpose, and in that moment, the truth became clear to them both. There was no escaping what had already begun. The forces they had tried to outrun were now too close, too real, and too powerful. They had no choice but to face it. The blinding light seemed to freeze time. Amelia and Ethan stood rooted to the ground, their eyes wide as the ground beneath them trembled, cracking like ancient stone. The figures, cloaked and silent, remained motionless for a moment, their eyes glinting like cold steel. It was as if they were waiting for something, waiting for the inevitable. Amelia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the air thick with tension, but it was the strange hum beneath their feet that terrified her the most. It was like a pulse, an ancient heartbeat that echoed through the very foundations of the city. Ethan stepped forward, his hand trembling around the key he still clutched. "What is this?" he whispered, more to himself than to Amelia. The hum intensified, vibrating through his entire body, as if something beneath them was awakening. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at the dark sky above them, where the stars were obscured by a swirling, unnatural cloud. It wasn't just the ground that was shifting. The air itself felt alive, as though it was pulling them toward something ancient, hidden for centuries, now resurfacing. And then, with a crack, the very earth beneath them split open, a blinding light spilling from the chasm. Ethan turned to her, his face pale. "We have to stop it," he said urgently, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. He had always believed he was guarding something powerful, something dangerous, but he never imagined this, a force that felt as though it could unravel everything. Before Amelia could respond, the figures stepped forward, their movements fluid and unnerving. They didn't speak, but Amelia knew they weren't there to negotiate. They were there to control, to take what was theirs. She reached for the letter again, her fingers shaking, and in that moment, she saw something that made her stomach twist. The familiar handwriting on the page, her father's, was now completely different, as though someone had rewritten it while she wasn't looking. Her heart raced. The words were no longer a warning. They were an order. "You will bring him to me. You will unlock the door. The artifact must be protected, or the world will fall." The last sentence was chilling. "The one you trust is not who they seem." The air around them crackled with electricity as the figures advanced. Amelia's mind raced, but everything seemed to slow, the weight of the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. Ethan, he wasn't just guarding the artifact. He was part of the plan. He had been chosen, and all of this, the chaos, the danger, had been set in motion by his own actions. The artifact was never meant to save them. It was a key to something far darker, something that had been hidden for a reason. She turned to Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. You're one of them, aren't you?" Ethan's face froze, the key in his hand now feeling like a dead weight. "What do you mean?" His voice was too calm, too controlled, but the hesitation in his eyes told another story. The silence between them stretched longer than either of them could bear. Amelia's mind whirled as she backed away, her breath shallow. The truth was beginning to take shape, something she hadn't wanted to admit, but couldn't ignore any longer. Ethan had been chosen for a reason, and it wasn't to protect them. He had always been part of their plan. The figures moved closer, their dark forms blending into the night. Amelia could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around her chest. The weight of her father's betrayal hung heavily in her mind. But just as she thought she couldn't breathe any longer, the world shifted again. A crack in the sky. A low, guttural sound filled the air, and a massive black shape began to form above them, casting a shadow so deep that it swallowed the light. "Amelia," Ethan whispered, stepping closer. "It's too late." And then the world broke apart. The ground rumbled beneath them, and from the blackness above, something massive, something ancient, descended. A creature neither human nor beast, with eyes that glowed like embers. The air became thick, suffocating. Amelia could barely breathe as she stared up at the creature, its massive form blocking out the stars. Ethan's voice was distant, as though the very presence of the creature was pulling him into its grasp. "This is why we're here. This is what we were meant to do." Her heart hammered in her chest as the realization hit like a bolt of lightning. Ethan had never been a protector. He had been the sacrifice. The artifact was never meant to stop the darkness. It was the key to unleashing it. Amelia took a step back, her mind reeling, her body frozen. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything she could have prepared for. There was no escape now. The battle was no longer about survival. It was about whether they could stop an ancient force from consuming everything. And as the creature loomed over them, the final, terrible truth began to unfold. Nothing, not even their choices, would stop the chaos that was about to be unleashed. The countdown had begun. The creature towered above them, its dark form blotting out the sky, casting an eerie, unnatural shadow. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest, her mind scrambling to make sense of everything that had led them here. Ethan stood beside her, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that wasn't fear but a cold, resigned acceptance. "This is it, isn't it?" Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of the key in his hand feeling like a curse. "We've done what we were meant to do," he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and the creature's glowing eyes flickered with a malevolent light. The world seemed to hold its breath. Amelia could feel the air thickening, a presence pressing down on her, suffocating her thoughts. She didn't know how much longer she could stand there frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. With a sudden deafening roar, the creature lunged forward, and everything seemed to unravel. Amelia instinctively reached for the key in Ethan's hand, but as she did, a flash of light exploded from the ground, sending them both sprawling. The sky above them tore open with a deafening crack, the air warping as reality itself began to bend. Amelia struggled to her feet, her vision blurred, but there, at the center of it all, was the artifact, now glowing with an intensity that made her skin burn. She could feel its pull, its energy wrapping around her like chains. This wasn't just any object. It was a conduit, a doorway. The creature had been guarding it, but the truth was far worse than she could have imagined. The artifact was never a weapon. It was the anchor holding the creature in this realm. Ethan staggered toward her, his eyes wide with realization. "It's not too late," he gasped. "We can still stop this. We have to destroy it." But Amelia's hand trembled as she reached for the artifact. It was as though it was alive, its power coursing through her veins. She could hear voices, whispers from the past, promises of untold power, of a world reshaped in the image of something older than time itself. Her heart raced as she realized the full extent of what she had uncovered. She wasn't meant to stop the creature. She was meant to join it. "No," Amelia whispered, fighting against the pull. "I won't let you." With every ounce of strength, she reached for the artifact, her fingers brushing against its surface. The energy surged through her, threatening to tear her apart. But then, in an instant, something within her snapped. It wasn't the artifact that held the power. It was her. She had been the key all along. With a roar that seemed to echo through the very fabric of the universe, Amelia wrenched the artifact free from the earth, her body crackling with energy. The creature let out a sound like thunder as it writhed in agony, its form beginning to unravel. The shadow that had loomed over the city began to dissipate, fading into the air like smoke. Ethan stumbled back, his eyes wide in disbelief. "Amelia, what are you doing?" But Amelia didn't answer. She felt the power surge within her, the weight of the decision heavy but clear. She was the one who had to make the final choice. The artifact was never meant to bring destruction. It was a test of strength, of will, of sacrifice. And she was the one who would decide its fate. Just as the creature let out a final, earth-shattering scream, everything went still. The energy that had once threatened to consume them all now hung in the air like a fragile thread. Amelia stood, holding the artifact, feeling the silence press down on her. And then, just when she thought the storm had passed, the unexpected happened. The ground trembled again, but this time, it wasn't the creature that was returning. A figure emerged from the shadows, the last person she ever expected to see. Her father. He stood there, cloaked in darkness, his eyes fixed on the artifact in her hands. "You've done well, Amelia," he said, his voice calm but cold. "But you were never meant to stop it. You were meant to awaken it." The truth crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Everything, the letters, the secrets, the lies, had all led to this moment. Her father had orchestrated it all. He had been the one behind the artifact's hidden power, behind the very creatures that had haunted their steps. And now, Amelia realized the horrifying truth. The artifact was not a key to save the world. It was a key to control it. Before she could speak, before she could even react, her father raised his hand, and the artifact began to glow once more, brighter than ever. The power surged through the air, wrapping around her like chains. But this time, Amelia wasn't helpless. She had the strength to fight back. With a roar of defiance, She raised the artifact high, and in a flash of blinding light, everything shattered. The world seemed to twist, collapsing in on itself before it erupted in a brilliant explosion of light. And then, there was nothing. The silence was deafening. Amelia lay on the cold ground, her body aching, her mind racing. She opened her eyes, not sure what to expect, but when she looked around, the city was gone. The world was still, empty, and broken. And there, in the distance, the only thing that remained was the faintest echo of her father's laughter. The creature was gone. The city was gone. And yet, one question still lingered. Was it really over? Or had Amelia just awakened something far worse than they could have ever imagined? Amelia woke to a world that felt both familiar and completely alien. The ground beneath her was cracked, the ruins of the city now little more than a hushed memory, a forgotten echo. She could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her chest. Her hands were still trembling, the remnants of the artifact's energy buzzing faintly beneath her skin. She had done it. She had stopped the creature, defeated her father's plan. But at what cost? She pushed herself up from the rubble, looking around, searching for some sign of life. The world was eerily quiet. No wind, no sounds of distant voices. The city, once alive with the hum of human activity, was now an empty shell. It felt as though time itself had stopped, the seconds stretching out like an endless void. She remembered the explosion of light, the moment she had raised the artifact high, and everything had shattered. But it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The truth lingered in her mind, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. Her father's last words echoed in her ears. Asterisk, you were meant to awaken if asterisk. Awaken what? What had she really unleashed? As her mind wandered back to that moment, her father's cold, calculating gaze, she realized that his plan had never been about destruction. It had been about control. The artifact was a tool, not a weapon. It was meant to reshape the world, to bend it to his will. The creature had been a guard, a force to protect the artifact's true power. And her father had orchestrated everything, including the path that had led her to make the final choice. But now, the world was different. She could feel it. The ground under her feet hummed with a strange, unfamiliar energy. The world she had known was gone. Her city, her home, her life, everything was gone. And yet, Amelia felt something else, something that transcended fear or regret. There was a strange, quiet power rising within her. She looked down at her hands, remembering how the artifact had surged through her, how it had given her the strength to stop her father, to break the chain that had bound the world for so long. But the world wasn't destroyed. It was reborn. The artifact, once a key to chaos, had become a bridge to something new, something unknown. She didn't know exactly what it was, but it felt like the beginning of something bigger than all of them. A voice called out from the distance. It was faint at first, but then clearer, more distinct. Amelia. She turned, squinting against the dim light. In the distance, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Ethan. He stumbled toward her, his face drawn, his eyes tired, but there was a spark of recognition in them. He had been lost, too, caught up in the storm of everything that had happened. But he was here now, and he was alive. Amelia, he said again, his voice hoarse, the words full of relief. I thought you were gone. She shook her head, a weak smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It's not over, she said softly. It's just beginning. Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. What do you mean? Amelia's gaze drifted across the desolate landscape. I've been thinking about everything we did, everything that happened. My father's plan, the artifact, the creature. We didn't stop it. We only triggered something. Ethan's eyes widened, and he took a step closer. Triggered what? The world isn't what it was anymore. It's changed. She looked down at her hands again, still feeling the remnants of the power that had surged through her. The artifact didn't destroy the creature. It didn't even stop my father. It did something else. Something we weren't prepared for. For the first time in what felt like forever, Amelia felt a sense of clarity. She had spent so long running from the truth, hiding behind the lies her father had spun, but now she understood. The artifact had never been a tool of destruction. It had been a way to access something beyond the known world, a force that transcended human understanding. It was a bridge to a new reality, one that was still unfolding, one that could be shaped by those who had the courage to wield its power. The creature, her father, even the artifact, they were only part of the puzzle. The real question was how to use this newfound power. How to rebuild, how to reshape the world that had been lost. "I don't know what happens next," Amelia said, her voice steady. "But I know we can't go back. We have to move forward." Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "But where do we start?" Amelia took a deep breath, her mind racing with possibilities. She didn't have all the answers. No one did. The world had been torn apart. But from the fragments, something new could rise. But it would take time, and it would take more than just her and Ethan. It would take others who had survived, who had been changed by the power that had been unleashed. "There's more out there," she said, glancing over the horizon. "We're not the only ones who survived. There are others, other people, other places. The world's broken, but it's not gone." Ethan's face softened, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Amelia saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. "And what do we do then?" "We rebuild," she said firmly, feeling the weight of her words. "We rebuild the world." The sun was beginning to rise, its light casting long shadows across the desolate land. Amelia and Ethan stood side by side, staring into the unknown. The future was uncertain, the path forward unclear, but one thing was certain: they would face it together. And as they walked forward, step by step, they carried with them the knowledge that everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, had led them here. To this moment. The world had changed, but they would shape it, together. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Amelia felt ready.